right, welcome to the Crow Discovery Project. Let's talk a little bit about trees. There was a video recently called No Trees on Flat Earth. And how about we set aside the shape of the earth for now and let's talk a little bit about trees. Here's a tree. This is what's called a sycamore maple. They were planted all over New England when the hardwoods were dying out, elms and other things getting diseases, and unfortunately at about 50 years this climate rots them out. That is why this tree is going away. We thought that this tree might be 150 years old, but you'll hear at the end I talked to the tree guys a little bit about trees. They think it's closer to 100 years old, and we did not count the rings, but you will see the rings at the end when I talk to the tree guys about trees in New England. But when we look at trees this age, whether it's 100 or whether it's closer to 150, the house behind it was built in 1865. And most people in the neighborhood, this is down the street from me, most people in the neighborhood thought this tree might have been planted when the house was put in. Tree guys think it's closer to 100, but let's talk a little bit about trees. In the recent video where the Devil's Tower is claimed to be a tree stump, there's a few things that I would point out that are just common sense. Here's a tree on the earth we live on, and it's made of wood. We don't have any examples of silicon-based life forms, and I think that's one of the claims in the video. So that's a common sense problem. This tree, let's just say it's 100 years old. Let's say the tree guys are right because they have a lot of experience with trees. And they do look, you'll see it when I'm talking to them at the end, you'll see how he's pointing out the rings. He doesn't count them all, but I think he tells me he counts up to about 70 years, something like that. And he doesn't get all the way through because of the shape of the cut. But can you imagine a tree going 6 kilometers into the air? I mean, wouldn't that be a structural problem? Do we know of anything that could even go a mile in the air? You know, I don't know what the tallest skyscraper is these days, but I know, you know, anything going up miles in the air, kilometers in the air is structurally not going to work for the reality that we're familiar with. The other thing that I think is pretty telling is at the end where you see the trunk cut off so you can see in at the rings. Trees have rings, and you know, for the most part you can judge the age of a tree by looking at the rings. You can tell things like the climates it's gone through, the tough years. As a matter of fact, at the end when the tree guys are showing me how the rings work, you'll see this last year we've had no rain, and he points out that it was a tough year by looking at the rings. But trees are key. One of the reasons I took the time to walk down the street and film all this is because there's no substitution for first-hand observation. If you want to know about things, you really need to observe it if you can. And I'm interested in why we don't have tons of examples of trees that are 7, 8, 9,000 years old. I've seen the trees in Yosemite that are some, I guess, supposed to be up to a couple thousand years old. And maybe that's not hard to imagine. They are massive. And actually one of the railroad magnates, I don't know whether it was a Rothschild or a Getty or who it was, had crews in there early on cutting down the biggest examples of those trees for some reason. But that brings me back to the question, why don't we have tons of examples of trees that are many hundreds of years old? And I asked the tree guys this because they go all over New England. There's a ton of people that work for this company, have a lot of experience with trees, and you'll hear the reason he tells me. But my thing is, there has to be a ton of areas that are inaccessible. I've seen them in like upstate New York, or like if you look at the movie Last of the Mohicans, it shows you kind of geography where nobody's going in to log in these areas. You couldn't. How would you possibly back in the day get anything out of these sheer cliffs and deep valleys and big old mountains? I mean, you couldn't. So again, where's all the examples? And I know we have like the baobab trees, which are supposed to be very old. The sequoias in Yosemite, which I have seen with my own eyes, and it's not hard to imagine that they are many, many hundreds of years old. And then everyone always points to that bristlecone pine that's out in the middle of nowhere somewhere. And that was at one point, we were told it was the oldest tree going. As a matter of fact, the geographic with the single eye with the title An End to Blindness, kind of reflecting the times where everyone's waking up now. In the back of that, they show, I think it's a pecan tree that is just massive. But, you know, people from all over the world listen to this, and I'd be interested to hear back from folks. Are you guys aware of trees around the world where you live, maybe, that are many hundreds of years old? I think it's a key thing. It feels like we should be able to see more of them. But that's my take on no trees on a flat earth. I think it has problems. And here, right now, I'm going to talk to the tree guys. So let's go ahead and listen. Okay, go ahead. Explain how it works.
You got the big ring here. Right there, the thick ring. Okay. That's your spring growth, because the trees grow a lot more in the spring. And then there's a thin ring right there, right around it.
The darker ring?
The darker ring. That's the rest of the year growth. So the summer.
So in spring, it makes a wide, light-colored ring?
Yep, it grows a lot more in the spring than it does the rest of the year.
And then at the end of that growing season, as you come into winter, a thin, dark line comes?
Yes, that's just the rest of the growth.
What's the oldest trees you guys have seen around New England? Have you ever seen a 500-year-old tree?
No.
No?
No.
Have you ever seen
most trees, like oaks, the hardiest trees, they kind of level off at like 350, I think.
And like, that's their lifespan?
Documented, generally. Obviously, there's a range. You know, you might get an older, like some species down south, like the live oaks.
Yeah.
I think they go well over 500 years.
You don't think there's any trees around here that'll live like 700 years?
I mean, in the right spot with the right conditions,
maybe.
Potentially. But chances are, whatever trees were around, see, turn of the century, Rhode Island, at 1900 was only 10% forest. There was only 10% forest in Rhode Island, turn of the century. We were actually hauling in firewood out of Maine because when we first settled, we clear-cut everything for agriculture.
And they were different trees than we have now?
Mostly all hardwood when we first landed. We clear-cut everything, and then a lot of the pines came back up, what we call field pines. Now, you go out in the woods and you see all these stone walls, and people think, why did they build stone walls in the woods? It was all farmland. Then, now we're getting a reforestation of 80 to 100-year-old trees in all these preservation areas. So the chances of a tree being over 100 years old in Rhode Island, automatically 90% right out the window, because there was only 10% of forest in Rhode Island turn of the century.
Why was it so sparsely forested to begin with?
Agriculture. When we first landed as pilgrims,
yeah,
we started cutting for firewood, to make tools.
So those people could have been cutting 700-year-old trees down. They
very well could have been cutting some very old trees at that point.
So making that, do you come from this area? Do you remember the elm that was down on Sepauwett that supposedly Washington and Lafayette were under? It was like a lone elm, went up 100 feet, last elm around?
Nope.
You don't remember it?
No, there's still plenty of elms around, but maybe not that age.
Yeah.
I see a lot of the elms get the disease. They get the Dutch elm disease, and a lot of them died off when we first landed. We brought the disease with us. So if you look back in history, again, only 10% turn of the century, so the chances of there being an old tree within that 10%, about slim to none. But there's plenty of little tiny pockets with older growth in it. But there's actually, in all of New England, there's only one place in Western Mass that's truly old growth forest, and they just claimed it old growth forest for the past 10 years because it hasn't been cut in the past 100 years.
And so what kind of trees are those, do you know?
That's a lot of, I think, hemlock and pine and stuff out in Western Mass in the Berkshires. Some smaller hardwood, but not a lot. It's a lot more of the conifer.
Do you know Weedamoo Woods that's right over there?
No, I'm not really too familiar.
Like by Four Corners?
No.
So those are all kind of secondary, not natural growth forests.
Yep. Like I said, true old growth, like when you go out west and you see the giant sequoias, that's an old growth forest. You can tell the diversity in the forest by the mix-up of trees, age, species, everything elapsed. So to find an old growth forest on the East Coast, slim to none. When the Pilgrims first landed, the shipbuilders got off the ships and they had a hammer with the stamp of the Crown of England. And they named, in the name of the king, they went around stamping timber grade trees for masts for the tall ships. So the Pilgrims actually didn't even get some of the nicest quality wood when they first landed. it was property of the king and it got shipped back for the shipbuilders.
So pretty much 100% of the old growth forest that was here
Close to it.
was
Close to it.
Very few exceptions.
Yep. And it was either cut, and it's horrible because a lot of the big trees, when we first landed, we're working with hand tools, axes, hand saws. They would actually cut down a large tree, take all the small wood off of it, and leave it to rot because they can't manage the big wood. So a lot of the big logs that they initially tipped rotted because they would wait for the forest to grow back in to 8-10 inch whole trees, and then they would harvest that for their firewood because it was easy to manage. You can cut it easier, you can split it easier. It's young growth. They actually didn't mill or do anything, not anything, but generally speaking, they were just basically leaving it to waste.
So how old do you think this tree was?
It was out to about 70 years here, so you could probably throw 80, maybe 85 as a rough guess.
People were thinking it might be 150 because that's when the house was put in.
I mean,
1865.
Again, I was a rough count because you can kind of see it fades out right here. So you kind of start guessing. There was some really tight rings in here. You can see the first 20, 30 years of growth were really strong growth. And you can actually tell when they cut down the giant sequoias and stuff, they can actually tell hardships in the climate.
Yeah.
You know, with forest fires and the rough years, drought years. There'll be 5-6 years of drought all stacked up, and you'll only get a quarter inch of ring. But there's 5 or 6 years of growth in there, and then that one real good year, there's over a quarter inch of growth right there when it was young. So you can kind of see as it tapers off, and then when you get out into the sapwood out here, these last few were actually pretty good years.
So we're looking roughly 150, huh?
I mean, that's pushing it. Maybe 90, maybe 100.
Oh, really?
Maybe.
Okay.
Again, rough count. You'd actually have to really
clean it up and count them.
You'd have to wash it off. Maybe throw a little oil on there to raise the grain to really tell what you're counting. And then you have to be good, like Jeff was saying, with the new wood and the old wood. You can kind of see it in this big ring right here. You can almost see the faintest line in the center. And some trees show it better than others. Maple, they tend to hold water, so it's kind of tough to tell, but you can actually see it. See right out here in this ring? You've got the bark, the cambium, and then this is this year's growth right here. You can see the tiniest, the faintest ring. You've got bark, sapwood, and then that's one growth ring right there. So this year's been kind of a hard year for it, from what I can tell.
And we haven't gotten any rain, really, so yeah.
It's been a tough year. Roger that.
All right, thanks, dude.
Not a problem.